interested over the years, I know for no other reason, coming to the center and participating on how these issues connect to the broader agendas. Perhaps you could share your reflections.
Sure. Thank you very much. First, let me say it's a little hard to start talking once you still have these absolutely fabulous images and pictures in your mind. And Suzanne's comments that we don't really want talking heads, the women speak for themselves. So there's a little irony there, but never mind. Let me start and thank PAI for an absolutely beautiful and powerful film that communicates so many important messages, and to the Woodrow Wilson Center for again providing us the opportunity to get together and talk about important development issues. And I would like also to thank my colleague, Irene Kitsinadis, who perhaps you could stand up. She has stepped in for Heather Diagnos, and so is a person you should know. She handles our pop environment portfolio. And thank you so much for your help in preparing these materials. Just a few words about my reactions to the film. I was so struck with the strength and resilience of the women and how connected the women's lives are to their environment, how their lives are really all of one piece. They're embedded in the cycle of nature and the necessity of feeding themselves and their families. And I was also struck with the amazing sense of hope, planning for better lives for their children in a context of really very dire circumstances. I can still see and hear the woman from Nepal who said, if they go to school, I think their future will be bright. We really hope so, but that ability to have that hope in this context was, I thought, amazingly powerful. And again, we heard the message about the importance of providing for their children in a changing and increasingly difficult environment. And the recurring theme of struggling to provide for their family so that their children might have a better future. So it's really very intuitive that our programs need to be integrated. Women's lives are integrated, their concerns are integrated, they're closely linked to the environment. It's intuitive that that's the way we need to program. But actually, intuition is not enough. And from the AID perspective, as we've defined our challenge in this area, we felt we needed to test approaches for integrated approaches, demonstrate impact, and then expand resources and programming to make this happen. And that's really what we've done over the past decade, and even actually further back than that. But in 2001, you may or may not know, Congress gave us a congressional directive to focus attention on the interaction between family planning and environmental issues, particularly in the areas with threatened biodiversity. That certainly has been done, and in fact, a much broader range of issues have also been addressed. And I think as I looked back over the history of it, I was struck with, in the very early days, I'm talking several decades ago now, our early rapid presentations did include population factors and how they interacted with resource factors, such as access to arable land, access to irrigation, and that sort of thing. So it's a long-standing issue that we've invested in for a long time, and we continue to be committed to. The decades of work have really demonstrated, I think, how family planning contributes to other key development outcomes that improve women's ability to adapt to climate change. And it's also demonstrated how it's smart and cost-effective to integrate family planning with other health interventions as well as other development programs. We've seen actually that poverty and development problems are and will be exacerbated by climate change, particularly in areas already ecologically challenged. And that these problems will also be intensified by the failure to provide women with the opportunity to space and limit their children. We've seen that multiple pronged strategies are required to meet the multiple needs of women in communities, to have healthy families, natural resource management, and sustainable livelihoods. And we know that, as the film so powerfully said, family planning is part of the solution. because it really gives women an opportunity to take control, to empower them, and to adapt to the environment, which is increasingly challenging. We know that family planning is an effective part of the solution because it's cost-effective, it's low technology, and perhaps most important of all, there's already substantial demand from women for this intervention. So in just a few minutes, let me highlight a couple of the research programs that we've invested in over the last few years and mention our large ongoing program, which is called Balanced. I think one of our most important and rigorously designed program research efforts was in the Philippines, which looked at coastal resource management and family planning. And it was dramatic. It was a rigorously designed quasi-experimental study, of the details of which I'll spare you. But I think it really lent scientific credibility to the assertion that when you do this kind of programming, rigorous, integrated, strongly implemented family planning and coastal resource management efforts, you can get dramatic effects. What we saw were very strong demographic as well as conservation effects. Reductions in the average number of children born to women, reductions in household size on the demographic side, also an increased knowledge and use of condoms by youth, which was quite striking in the Philippine context, which has been sometimes challenging to program in family planning. On the environmental side, we saw improvement in coral condition indices, also a reduction in the mangrove cutting and charcoal making, and an easing of the income poverty challenges for young people. So the program had very, very strong results, and importantly, now that evidence is used to scale up the relatively small-scale implementation, and as currently, I believe it's in 56 municipalities in 14 provinces. So we think this work provides a very good model for addressing key issues in an integrated way. As I mentioned, our current POP environment project is called Balanced and is supporting capacity building, research, dissemination of implementation tools, and best practices around the world. Let me just mention work in Zambia in the populations living near the national parks, designed to provide sustainable sources of alternative income, as well as integrated family planning and reproductive health services. One of our projects that is actually addressing the climate change issue is the glacial melt study in Asia and the Near East, which is looking at vulnerability of populations due to climate change in the greater Himalayan region and working to develop multi-sectoral responses to that challenge. And this is very, very broad-based, multi-sectoral, including governance, nutrition, gender equality, regional cooperation, as well as family planning and other health interventions. So that is ongoing, and we'll look forward to the results of that. We work collaboratively with a wide range of donors. One activity in the Lake Victoria Basin with Packard and MacArthur Fund and being implemented by Pathfinder is designed to address in a similar way the range of multiple programs that individuals who are in these kinds of environments need to adapt to the circumstances. So a wide range of things going on. Again, I would refer you to Irene, who can provide broader lists or more detail on some of these projects. But our commitment remains firm to address these issues and then evolve as the focus of the work in the broader population environment field develops. As I said, as climate change receives growing attention in this area, I think it'll be important to continue to address POP and family planning issues in that context. That is, to look in detail at the reciprocal relationships between climate change, family planning, and population dynamics. One piece of which I haven't mentioned, and which is a very important one, is migration. This was touched on in the film, and I think has major challenges for individuals, families, and population dynamics as a whole. So as we move forward in this area, the issues so vividly raised by the film today, and I think the lessons of the past decade concerning how to test effective integrated PHE programming should provide a good guide for us as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. You referred to a number of excellent resources there and projects that we will make sure in the write-up of this on the Wilson Center site we have references to all those. I think
Good.
In a number of cases we've working with those partners have been able to help tell some of those stories with meetings here on this stage, in fact. So we'll make sure to make those available. Esther, if we could turn to you. You've obviously combined in kind of training and capacity building function, but also the larger kind of mega conference and and everything in between these issues of climate change and reproductive health. Perhaps you could reflect on the film and what themes struck you when you saw it.
All right. The film is very compelling. It's a story that I'm very able to connect with, and I know a lot of young women in my community can connect with the movie because it's a true story. In my family, I'm the first person to go to school, to get a university education, and my mother didn't get the opportunity to do that. But she believed that if I go to school, I'll be empowered to better shape my future, different from hers. I didn't get sex education at home. I only got it in school and through the work of some non-profit organization, and there I learned how to understand my sexuality better. Sometimes I wonder if my mother didn't have the capacity to tell me about my sexuality, to tell me about my, to have sex education discussion at home, or she didn't know how to tell me. But she believed that if I'm empowered enough as a young woman, I can better shape my future. I can be where I am today. So I'm very grateful for that. Back home, access to water is a very big problem. In my community, we don't have that kind of money to drill a borehole, so we get one of the sources of our water is in the stream. And when we don't have enough rain to bring an amount of water that is easily accessible, we have problem getting water for domestic use. So I have a friend of mine who had a problem because she went to the next village to fetch water because the water in the village had dried up. And the mother needed water so much to cook because if a father comes home without having food on the table, he will not be happy. So she went to another community to fetch water, and then in the process she was raped. And that was very, very terrible for her because at that point her future was, her dreams as a young woman, her future was was divided. She didn't know what to do again, and maybe she did not get sex education at home or at school, or maybe she wasn't empowered enough to be assertive, to know her sexual right, to be able to say no, or to be able to speak out. Because, of course, when you're raped, it's not something you want to talk about, And she had lived a very post-rape life that she had to hide that she was raped, and then she got pregnant, and then she was exposed to other things like that. And that's the reason why I began to work on sexuality issues. Young women need to know about their sexuality. They need to be empowered to be assertive, to be empowered to know how to speak out when things are wrong. And so I work like that. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I got an information back home that over 300 families were displaced because of flooding in northern Nigeria. And this is very terrible because the displaced families had to be sheltered in the schools and mosques with very poor sanitary conditions. And imagine young women in those conditions, they're exposed to so many things. When a young woman is not in school, she's likely to do some other things that she wouldn't have done. So it's very important to empower women. That's why I have worked on sexuality issues to educate my peers, and then I've worked on climate change advocacy because they need to listen to young people to speak and to hear their views in terms of designing adaptation strategies.
So, Tanya, you're coming from CARE that obviously is a major player in a broad realm of development frames. And have been a leader on tackling climate change issues and adaptation issues, as well as working in the family planning and reproductive health space. How do you see the kind of themes in the film and resonating, and particularly with institutions like yours that aren't devoted to one of those sectors, but really about addressing them as a whole?
I think, well, first I want to thank Population Action International and the Woodrow Wilson Center for really having us and for helping put together the film and for helping raise awareness of the issue. It's still challenging to talk about both climate change as well as family planning. You put the two together and it's a bit of a double whammy. So I really appreciate that you're still bringing these issues to the fore. As you mentioned, CARE does a lot of work across a number of sectors. But I want to echo what Sarah said, that is, and you see this in the film, the communities and the people and the women that we work with, they don't think in sectors. They don't think in silos. For them, it's all connected. And so we, even as an organization, are working to integrate climate change programming throughout our portfolio. We're working to shift more toward a program approach so that we look at the whole of a woman's life from start to finish, from the beginning of the day to the end of the day, so that we're really integrating all of the pieces that really impact the experience that she, her husband, and her children have. You know, what underpins all of CARE's work is this notion of women's empowerment and gender equality. Why is that? You know, we see in the film the role that women play, and so oftentimes we can tell that women are incredible agents of change. Research shows that when you give a woman control over a household budget, when you put the cash in her hands, it goes back into human development. It goes back into helping her family. But it's also not, it's not a matter of looking at a woman and seeing her just as a tool for eradicating poverty. She's a woman. And so, you know, CARE's work is focused not just on eradicating poverty, but also on tackling social injustice. And so it is ultimately about gender equality. And that ripples then into a lot of our climate change work. We saw tons of the impacts in each of the stories. The woman in Ethiopia, Peru, and Nepal, they all talked about water availability, whether it's glacial melt or shifts in rainfall patterns. That has ripple effects on food security, on nutrition, and then on health. So when we look at adaptation programs, we try to put women and the most vulnerable populations at the center of them. And for CARE, a lot of that starts both with program and with advocacy. It starts with vulnerability. It starts with doing a comprehensive and participatory analysis of the community dynamics. Who in this community is most vulnerable? Because we see at the global level that there's a discussion of which countries are most vulnerable. But from our experience, we know that vulnerability differs not just between countries, but within countries, within communities, and also within households. And so it really begins with that so that you can identify who's most vulnerable and you can identify why, so that you can target your interventions to really addressing their needs, to prioritizing their needs and prioritizing the most vulnerable. It also means engaging the most vulnerable populations in all stages of work, from planning to implementation and also to monitoring and evaluation. In order to do that, though, oftentimes you also have to wrap advocacy into your efforts. You have to make sure that communities are able to liaise with their local governments. And that's something that we're doing in a project in northern Ghana, is working with communities, having separate dialogues between men and women so that each of them can talk about the impacts that they're seeing, what they see as under threat from the impacts of climate change, or what they see as most vulnerable. And you bring those different perspectives to the fore. You work to really link the communities with their local governments. As a lot of governments are starting to plan on how to tackle the impacts of climate change, they're also looking at moving that to the local level. Climate impacts are extremely localized, especially if you look at the context of a place like Peru, where you have microclimates, different altitudes. The impacts are incredibly different from one side to the other side of the mountain. So it's really just working to empower those communities to work with their national governments, making sure that women are equally represented on, in those dialogues so that their concerns are being brought to the fore. And then also just working within communities generally to just bring to light what some of the different power dynamics are, so that you're really promoting the position of women and recognizing what the disproportionate labor burden may be on them as they're responsible for gathering food, fuel, water, caring for the elderly, caring for their children, making sure that there is an open discussion of that. In CARE's work on women's empowerment, it at no point in time means that you don't engage men and boys as well. You have to. It's really about bringing the entire community together just to talk about the different dynamics. And that filters across our programs, across our adaptation work, and then also into our advocacy at the national as well as international level.
Thank you, Tanya. CARE is obviously a shining example of an institution that gets it across the integration and such. And Suzanne, can I ask you, because Population Action International has distinguished itself by trying to reach out to those kinds of partners and work with other organizations so they get to a place where CARE is in terms of recognizing the integration and the kind of interconnectivity of these issues. So can you talk a little bit about how you see the film supporting your efforts to reach out to those groups, but at the same time reflect perhaps on what message do you want to send the family planning and reproductive health sector, which is a sector that can just play within its own boundaries and not necessarily play well with others. So if you could talk about how to reach out to sectors outside the community, but also what kind of messages and kind of ways that you can use films like this and such to reach them.
And this is being recorded.
Yeah, well, we're all about connections.
Evocative discussion. Well, I guess I'll answer the first part of the question first, which is, how I see PAI's work in the film and really putting as a priority outreach to other communities. I mean, it's what we call our linkages work. And I think it's, I hope that my U.S. advocacy colleagues won't disagree with this, but regrettably, there's just not enough, as I say, sort of pure champions for family planning and reproductive health. That's sort of never been the case for our movement, and so if you expect that we're going to win battles, particularly in such a resource-constrained environment and such a politicized environment, just based on your champions, the ones you always turn to, I think you're going to lose time after time. And so we were founded 45 years ago by a bunch of politicians across the political spectrum, but certainly some conservative Republicans in the mix who really understood the centrality of family planning to the advancement of women's health and rights. They might not have phrased it quite that way, but regardless, they were champions all the same. So that's just part of our DNA, it's part of our history, and we continue to find success in really opening and sort of just getting new entry points to the work. So of course we've got a long history on population health and the environment. In the last couple of years, it's been really heavily characterized by our climate change adaptation work, but I think under the leadership of Roger Mark D'Souza, our Vice President of Research, you'll really see from PAI kind of a rebroadening of that effort to go back to kind of PHE as a whole and beginning to explore other pieces of the environmental portfolio. And I'm personally really vested in that. I started my career as an environmental grant maker at Wallace Global Fund, and so back in the early 90s, making really some of the first advocacy grants around climate change. And at that time, Wallace Global Fund had two portfolios, an environmental portfolio and a pop portfolio. And because personalities were what we worked well together and communicated across portfolios, and we were incentivized to work together. But that's not traditional within the foundation world. And so that's also another example that I'd love to sort of bring to bear, not just on the work of the nonprofit sector, but the work of the philanthropic sector as well. And some other pieces in the film that come out for me, and just hearing some of my colleagues talk, that you'll see also begin to be more explored by us, and I think it will characterize what sort of communities we're reaching out to in the next couple of months and years. One is this whole piece around disaster management and emergency response and the flooding that Esther talks about in northern Nigeria. We've tackled that issue in sort of small part around the reproductive health supplies question, but I think there's a lot also there around the PHE piece and how you put reproductive health and family planning as a central response of disaster management and response. I think there's also what Tanya just mentioned around labor and work. I think there's some really interesting collaborations that can be built between our community and theirs. And I think that we, with a film like this, what we're trying to do is sort of show sort of something that I said in my opening remarks, that this issue is incredibly central. And so what you have to get past is the people who try to politicize it and try to turn it into a us versus them. The Huffington Post blog that I published today is about that. This issue is everywhere. I mean, your friends talk about it because they want kids or they don't want kids, or because they're having sex with, however, it's central to everybody's existence, and yet somehow we don't always translate that to the political sphere and the policy sphere, and that's what PAI is trying to bridge. And then the last piece, of course, is just food and water security, and of course food security top of everyone's mind right now with the famine in the Horn of Africa. So again, I think you'll see PAI with our climate work and our PHE portfolio trying to reach out to those communities and talk again about family planning and the centrality of sexual and reproductive health and rights to their issue. As far as our community is concerned, I have to say that we found more receptivity to it than one might expect. In these times of resource constraints, I don't think that as many partners within the community are taking this on simply because they don't have the bandwidth, they don't have the energy, they don't have the capacity, they may not have the resources, but they're certainly open to the conversation and are supportive always of PAI. One thing I like about our advocacy community that I don't think is as understood by the external world as it should be is it's a pretty sophisticated sort of coalition of advocates who get that some people have to be over here, some people have to be over here, and people have to be right down the middle. And that if you don't undercut each other's efforts, you're actually always making room for everybody else. And so I think that's probably the most robust response we get from coalition partners who may not have a climate change portfolio, but they're glad we are. And they were glad that we're talking to members of Congress who they would never get an appointment with if they opened with a sexual and reproductive rights agenda. If we go in about climate change adaptation, we might open a conversation with somebody who would never think about, his or her interest in climate change being at all related to women's empowerment. And that's one of the reasons, I've been at PEI for 8 years. It's one of the reasons I love the work and I love the institution, because those conversations are new and are constantly uncovering new kernels of truth that I think are invaluable in this environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really think that the comments from all of you reflect the importance of, and now you're getting to some of the ways that we try to achieve what Sarah started out saying, that as well, and your film ended by saying that the family planning is part of this solution. The notion of breaking down the boundaries between what is an appropriate climate intervention adaptation strategy and what is not an inappropriate strategy, but just not in the same conversation. And so how do we, the challenges that climate give us are so dramatic that it's kind of an all hands on deck, and you don't want to leave any tool unused for lowering vulnerability. And finding ways to kind of normalize that conversation is really what you are all reflecting. Well, we want to bring all of you into this conversation. My colleagues have microphones that they will bring to you. We ask that you use those so the folks on the video can hear the question as well. We have one in the very back and then one in the very front. So maybe Kaylee, you could come down. Kristen, if you could go all the way to the very back. Why don't we start with you since you got the mic first?
Marisa Lino, I just wanted to ask whether there are obstacles to showing a film like this, say, in high schools. I think it would be really eye-opening for kids who live with 600 electronic gadgets to see a film like this.
Maybe
it's a marvelous film.
Suzanne, you can talk about the larger efforts that you alluded to up front in terms of your plans for the film.
Well, I guess the way to answer that question is that there may be obstacles, but we would let our partners help us navigate those. So in the same way that we would never go into a country like Ghana and say, hey, PAI is here and this is our new and latest film, we would only work through existing partners at the national level, folks who know their political climate, folks who know the context, folks who know the players, and individuals who can say an evening event at a downtown Accra theater with a little bit of food and wine is really going to bring out the crowd, and that's what we then do. And so the same way we would work with high schools around the United States. We would let our local partners tell us if this is something the community is going to be open to or not. PAI, again, we don't have field offices. We don't accept government money. We're a pretty lean and mean shop, which means that we have to constantly, sort of piggyback on the strength and intellect of our partners in the field, if that's at a Nebraska high school or if that's at, a Ghana family planning clinic. So we're open to it, and I would love to be connected to anyone who wants to screen this film anywhere.
Question very back, and then we'll come down.
Hi, I wanted to thank you all for coming today. I also wanted to ask 2 questions, if at all possible. The first one being, in terms of the past 10 years, congressional approval and administration's approval, in terms of using U.S. foreign aid to sort of promote condom use and birth control pills overseas, how that's sort of changed over the past decade. And my second question was actually about how you delineate or define economic migrants versus climate change migrants, if you do want to do that. Because at least in terms of the legal framework with the Kampala Convention and the guiding principles on internal displacement, there is a difference, but obviously those 2 things are sort of inextricably linked, especially in terms of rural to urban migration. So, thank you.
Okay. Anyone want to?
Okay, yes, I think correct me if I didn't hear this right. I think your question was how has or if U.S. foreign aid has been used to promote condom use?
Or changes over time. How that support has evolved over time, the ups and downs.
Okay. Yes. Well, that's a statistical question. Condoms have always been a major part of our family planning portfolio method mix, and in fact have been provided in the broadest range of services because they don't have to be delivered in the clinical context. So obviously they're available in the clinical context. They are available to be provided by community health workers. They're available social marketing. So all of those are true, and they've always been vigorously promoted within the family planning program. I would say there was a dramatic uptick with condom promotion under the PEPFAR program, so that when they were procured and also promoted and delivered through all of the mechanisms of the HIV/AIDS programs, that expanded perhaps by 2 or 3 times the volume of condoms that were procured and distributed overseas. I will say that from our demographic and health surveys, we know that in virtually every country, almost all individuals know about condoms and the availability and where to procure a condom. As they've been promoted in different ways by different types of programs, people's view of their acceptability changes. I don't want to get into that too much in detail, but if there are massive campaigns to promote them as preventing HIV transmission, for example, that can potentially reflect on acceptability as a family planning method. But there's lots of data available on trends in use from demographic and health surveys, and I'd refer you to their DHS site, which provides some very good data on that. Basically, the amount we've been procuring has been growing as our HIV/AIDS programs and family planning programs have grown also.
Can I add to Sarah's
Please.
remarks? I mean, just sort of the more macro picture on your question is that the U.S. has been, just an incredible leader in the provision of finances for international family planning and reproductive health. We had some lean years in the last decade. We always say that money matters, but policy counts. So on both the money front and the policy front, we had some tough intervening years where things weren't where they should be. In the last couple of years, we've seen certainly funding levels be at all-time highs. Right now we're in a congressional battle for 2012. We'll see where we end up. What we're also always leaving our eye on is the policy question, because you can have all the money in the world, but if you've got restrictive policies and really irrational sort of limitations on evidence-based programs, that money's not going to get you anywhere. So it's been a moving target, to answer your question in short, and we've got a series of Washington memos that we published that give you a little bit of that snapshot at different places along the way to talk about that last decade. There's no easy way to answer your question.
How about the migration question? Anyone want to tackle that one?
I'll take a stab at it. I think you highlight one of the biggest challenges when we start seeing the impacts of climate change lead to migration is how do you classify migrants, whether it's the rural to urban or whether it's a permanent migration like you saw with one of the women from Peru who, her entire family decided to migrate because their livelihood was no longer viable. And so it's becoming an increasing topic of conversation. Different studies are being done. CARE and UN University are starting a study as well that looks at migration, rainfall patterns, and food security. So you've highlighted a question that I don't know that there's an answer to yet, but it's something that needs to be discussed more and more, especially when you look at both IDP as well as refugee legal frameworks.
Yeah, we as a preview on December, I think 7th or 8th, we'll have a session on climate change and migration with John Barnett, a geographer from University of Melbourne. It is a very vexing question when it comes to some of the legal frameworks that you alluded to, and one might even say it's impossible to distinguish between economic and then you'd also say environmental versus climate, right? Because not all climate is environment. Those are not synonymous. So the challenge of making that distinction in some ways reinforces this notion of interconnected multiple vulnerabilities, and you make decisions to move or not move based on a lot of factors. But finding ways to respond in a robust fashion to that new reality is really our challenge. I think the danger is when the press releases are issued with enormous 50 million figures of climate refugees, which is wrong for all sorts of reasons, because they're not all refugees, i.e. crossing borders and has a specific legal standing, etc. So when we play fast and loose, particularly on the advocacy side, we get in trouble on this. And so this kind of nuance is exactly what we need. Who would like to? Yes, gentlemen.
Hi, I'm Hugh McElrath. I'm a retired intelligence officer. In the sort of small, tightly construed, old-style national security establishment, we talked about lanes in the road, and these were very explicit and programmatic. And I'm sure in USAID and Department of Agriculture, Department of Energy, anybody involved in development at the government level, there are lanes in the road, or to mix metaphors, a zone defense. Susan Ehlers referred to sort of an informal division of labor among NGOs. And I guess my question is there, and if not, as I suspect, should there be a more formal division of labor within the NGO community?
That's a really interesting question.
And are you talking specifically on advocacy or on programs writ large? I mean, but certainly.
You answer the way you want to.
Well, I would say let's not formalize it because it's working like it is. I mean, I think that the sort of, I don't know if my colleagues would agree or disagree. I mean, on the programmatic front, certainly there's a lot of divisions between different groups and different sectors, and we're always trying to work across those silos to get better at interdisciplinary and kind of cross-sector approaches. I think as soon as you try to formalize that kind of collaboration, it somehow loses its juice. So I would, that said, I love groups that take a really holistic approach to development and that really understand there's a lot of nuance to these issues and that a woman doesn't live her life in a silo. I mean, she's constantly struggling across development sectors, if you will. I mean, on the advocacy side, I would say definitely don't formalize it. Part of the reason that it works is because there's just a really respectful and sophisticated implicit agreement that you occupy a certain space and I occupy a certain space. And we might have different messages, different tactics, different approaches, but if we all have a shared set of common values, which I think within the international reproductive health community we largely do, certainly where the U.S. government and our advocacy there is concerned, I would say it's kind of working like it is. A little bit loosey-goosey for some taste, but if it's yielding results, and as much results as we can expect in such a tough environment. I don't know if you have other ideas.
Well, I might just chime in. Of course, within USAID, we have a challenge of funding streams, and funds can only be used for certain technical areas to some extent. That having been said, I think the current leadership of aid is very much about what's referred to as smart integration. In other words, a recognition of exactly the kind of dynamics that are highlighted in the film, that, if the folks have problems with sustainable income, you don't just do family planning for them. So the challenge is to bring the pieces of the organization together that have these various funding streams and address the range of issues that's necessary to get some kind of impact. So it certainly creates challenges in terms of money flow and challenges in terms of reporting. But I think there's enough development experience now out there in terms of program research on what works and what doesn't to make us feel that it's worth the challenges of programming across these streams.
A couple in the back, Jason, then the lady right behind her, and then we have one over here.
Thanks, Jason Bremner from Population Reference Bureau. I'll continue along the lines of the lanes and the silos, and I guess this is a question for CARE. You talked a little bit about vulnerability and the way that you view or take a holistic look at vulnerability. It's my experience looking at vulnerability assessment tools that those tools themselves ask a lot of questions and of families, of individuals, and even have gender guidelines, specific questions to explore gender vulnerabilities. But they don't explicitly ask questions about childbearing, child rearing, family planning, or lack of access to family planning. And therefore, a lot of these questions or issues that we see in the film don't work their way into adaptation plans, don't work their way into adaptation projects, and don't work their way into the conceptual thinking of people who are doing climate change adaptation, even though the film shows that adaptive capacity resilience, vulnerability are affected by a woman's lack of access to the means to have the number of children she wants to have. So maybe you could talk about your own experience at CARE with vulnerability assessments and what you know of others.
Sure. Yeah, I'll speak generally since I do come from the policy and advocacy side rather than the implementation side. But a lot of what we talk about when we address vulnerability as CARE is really starting with a comprehensive analysis that's also participatory, so that as you're asking questions, it really comes back to what the community and the women or the men in the community themselves identify as their greatest areas of vulnerability. So it's ultimately it's a strategy that's built based on what the community is looking for. If that is something that a woman in the community really identifies as an area where assistance would help, then that's going to come to the fore. And then making sure that that woman is taking part in the planning process helps to ensure that those concerns continue to trickle up from the household plan, the community plan, the local government's plan. I think for us it really does come back, though, to making sure that you're exploring what the community sees as its vulnerabilities, and then also exploring different options with them. And so as you're looking at building a community strategy, an organization can always bring different issues to the table for discussion, working with the community to shift different livelihood strategies, introducing something new. But when it comes to the notion of ownership and the sustainability of a program, it has to rely on really what the community is most looking for. And I guess when I think of a vulnerability assessment, my hope would be that through some of those gender questions and through some of the disaggregated dialogues, if you're talking to a group of women by themselves, that those issues would come to the fore. That would be my hope.
Esther, in your work in starting the work on youth and coalitions around climate change, were some of these, were you able to integrate these multiple sectors into some of that advocacy work in Nigeria?
Yeah. Basically, in climate change in my country, the past years has been within light NGOs and consecutives. They just discuss it by themselves. And when I began interest in climate change, I realized that there was no mention of young people in terms of governance, in terms of adaptation, in terms of consultation. I was like, no, we are part of the Agenda 21 that my country signed on to. And talking about young people, there's no mention of even young girls where I come from. So it's something that I became very passionate about, and I started engaging them and questioning them. They cannot be talking about sustainable development. You don't think about involving young people in discussion, involving young people in consultations regarding climate change issues in the country. So, and then when I began the engagement, I realized that women as a whole was not something they also took seriously. Coming from a culture where men are the monopoly of knowledge, it became very, very interesting to do that. But now, in the past 4 years, it's been growing up, and the discussion has been opened, and they're welcoming gender issues into that. We have gender coalitions on environment. We have a gender media correspondent on environment. So it's been part of that. Right now, back home, we're trying to develop a second national communication to the UNFCCC, and gender has been one of the cross-cutting issues. But they've excluded the young people, which was very, very interesting. And of course, I have to speak out on that, because even at the UNFCCC level, young people are now official constituency. That means we are now also stakeholders in the discussion. So it's evolving, but it's not very certain. We have to basically keep inducing youth participation in processes back home. So I hope that when I go home, I could continue discussion on gender and climate change. And I thank PAI for having me here to learn, see how I can continue to begin discussion back home on gender and climate change.
That's terrific. Ma'am, there's a question right behind Jason, or maybe she had to depart. Sorry, lost her. I waited to yeah. Roger Mark, was that a question? No? Okay. I just can't see, guys. It's dark. So if you just grab the mic and go. Okay.
Hi, I'm Laura Henderson from the World Wildlife Fund, and thank you very much. It was a wonderful film, very interesting discussion. I just wanted to say that given that there's both a lack of information on climate change and a lot of misinformation in the United States on climate change, I think that the film can play many very important roles. And I was wondering, sort of, particularly for you at PAI, of what some of your thoughts are of once people see the film. I think for a lot of people it will be somewhat eye-opening, and they may say, what next? What can I do? Is there some action? And I'm wondering if you're thinking of including that in any way with the filmings, or just that whole advocacy component about what next.
So what's the ask?
Well, weatherincchange.org has a pretty extensive media player that will have all the extra footage actually that didn't make it into the film, so some other really compelling stories from women in those 3 countries that I invite you to look at. Also an advocacy guide, which we always produce with any film. And depending on, sort of what kind of venues we did screenings at, either on the Hill or, at sort of a movie theater in downtown Lusaka, of course our approach to the advocacy piece would be a bit different. I think there's a few really easy entry points depending on kind of who your audience is. There's a whole sort of set of work that can be done around communications and messaging and support that we're giving to the environmental community to better tackle those questions, again, from a platform of shared common values, especially as world population approaches 7 billion. There's, of course, legislative/advocacy opportunities, perhaps more limited now than we'd like them to be, both domestically and internationally, but it's a dialogue worth having because your door's not always closed. You can always sort of push it open a bit. There's Durban upcoming, there's Rio upcoming, so certainly we have some ideas and talking points on how an institution from, really any sector or stripe could get engaged in those conferences and those conversations. And I also think, again, regardless of where you're at, either a private family foundation or you're at an NGO or you're within a government agency, it's this idea of how do you incentivize people to work across sectors? How do you reward people for integrated and sort of holistic approaches? And so I think that's another part of our outreach is sort of once you've seen this, what in your daily job can look a little bit different that begins to touch some of these, sort of complicated but connected issues. And it's small steps, but as you said, I think this is going to be eye-opening for some people who thought climate change and family planning, you got to be kidding me. It's actually much more closely linked than people will expect, and I hope that they're able to do either small things or big things with that, that new knowledge. And WWF, you guys have been great partners, both at headquarters level and certainly in the field, so thank you for that. You guys are real leaders in the environmental community in tackling this set of issues.
We've focused almost exclusively on adaptation and climate change, and I think there is a lot of very good reason for why that is so. Do we leave mitigation off the table completely? We've had some very interesting academic research in terms of trying to understand some of the implications of multiple scenarios, where people live, how many people, how age structure and stuff. Should that be part of this conversation? Is that a separate conversation? I mean, unfortunately, the mitigation adaptation conversations often go on apart as it is. Is that something in this context that should continue as distinct, or are there ways that those two come together?
I'm happy to start with that.
Two knowing looks here. Yeah.
Yes, I'm happy to start with
that.
One? First and foremost, I'll say that you cannot adapt your way out of the problem of climate change. Right. So you can never, in a conversation about climate change, you can never leave mitigation off the table. Absolutely. When you get into the realm of talking about mitigation and population, I would take you back to the concept of lifestyle. It's not necessarily the number of children that a woman in Ethiopia, Malawi, Nepal, Bolivia has. It's the lifestyle that many of us, and I am pointing to myself, that many of us lead in terms of the size of our carbon footprint. I think one of the statistics I've heard, and I might have the exact figures wrong, is that the average carbon footprint of an American is about 29 times the size of the average carbon footprint of a person in Malawi. So it's really about lifestyle when you talk about mitigation.
And the film did include that with some of the text up front. Yes. About we all impact the earth, but not equally.
Right,
so some of
right.
That.
And I really liked that message because it drives it home that there are steps that any of us can take. Take the metro, don't drive. Switch to different kinds of light bulbs, whatnot. But the steps you can take are different. We can work with developing countries to make sure that we're increasing their access to clean technology so that as they develop, they can take a low carbon emissions pathway. But ultimately, when it comes to mitigation, the responsibility concretely lies with a certain group of countries more so than developing countries.
Yeah, one would hope at least that some of the particularly clever field-based interventions that can combine the two. I'm thinking, I mean, I know there's an awful lot of attention, and some would say too much attention to the question of fuel-efficient cook stoves and such. But some of, for example, some of the Mercy Corps projects in refugee camps in DRC Congo that are in part funding more of the fuel-efficient cook stoves that increase, address air quality and health issues, that reduce the burden on the local forests, but are also using it to generate income by trading the offsets on the European market to then buy more cook stoves and increase the program. So you're getting mitigation benefits, you're lowering the vulnerability of those households, and you're finding ways to bring these things together so that they don't have to have a kind of church and state division.
I would add just one word to, I agree that you can't adapt your way out of the problem. And in addition to mitigation being about lifestyle, I would also remind people that you can have a mitigation conversation from a rights-based perspective. And so that would be PAI's perspective. We've got limited bandwidth, and so adaptation is really where we've seen our easiest entry points. But if you are going to talk about mitigation, obviously population growth contributes to carbon emissions, but just make sure you're doing it from a completely holistic rights-based perspective, and you'll be okay.
Terrific. Well, Jason, did you have a follow-on to that? Okay, we'll give you the mic then.
Okay. But I will be on Saturday, so I'm going to Kenya. But we actually held a workshop. Actually, PAI and PRB held a workshop prior to the International Family Planning and Conference in Kampala on population and climate change, and it was a workshop for African population family planning advocates to get their take on messages around population and climate change. And we explored the idea of both adaptation and mitigation and talking points and what works and what doesn't. And what I was surprised to hear was that the mitigation discussion was not a non-starter with them. These were pop and family planning advocates from sub-Saharan Africa who felt comfortable with, of course, starting with the caveat that most emissions are coming from the West, that their work on family planning also contributed to a lessening of emissions. So they were starting with a rights-based perspective. They're pop and family planning people. But they said, I can also say something about how my work is about improving women's lives, about improving the prospects for development in my country and contributing to the global efforts to combat climate change. And they were not resistant to that. That doesn't mean that I'm seeing them all speak out on that regularly, but I think we're more cautious about it than our counterparts who work in Africa feel that they could be on this.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. Thank you, Jason. This has been a terrific discussion. I think PAI is to be congratulated for producing this film that, again, reflects PAI's legacy of bringing these issues together and making connections and telling stories that have kind of larger lessons to learn. I want to thank our four panelists for your excellent and kind of diverse perspectives on these complex topics. It's really been, I think, a very useful conversation. And thank our audience for some excellent questions and comments. We will be interested to hear about the future events that you do with Weathering Change, and look forward to all of you taking advantage of those opportunities as well. So please join me in thanking our panelists.